Okay, we are now on the bottom of Tzadiyom and Aleph, about to turn to Tzadiyom and Beis, and we're learning the Sugyas HaGemara. Amar Rabbi Yehuda, the last line on the Amud. Amar Rav, the name of Rav. Shochatim v'zarkin al tful yom u'mechutza kippurim. According to this quote of Rav, you're allowed to shech the Pesach on behalf of tful yom. This is a person who is tamei, and he went to mikvah, and we just have to wait until sunset, and then he's allowed to eat kodshim. So tonight, on the 15th, the night of the 15th, he'll be able to eat the Korban Pesach. We'll shech the Korban Pesach on his behalf on the 14th. And the same is true of Mechusa Kapara. He has to bring his Karbanos. But although before he eats his Karbanos, he cannot eat any kodshim, but nevertheless, this is the day in which he could bring his kodshim. And by nightfall, he's brought his kapara, and therefore he can eat from the Korban Pesach. We'll check the Korban Pesach on his behalf. But Ein Shoftin, here we're on the top of Tzadiyom and Beis. Ein Shoftin v'zorkin al tmei sheretz. In the case of a tmei sheretz, who will go to mikvah and then with Hariv Shemesh, with nightfall, he'll be able to be tar and eat kodshim, we're not going to check the Korban Pesach on his behalf. And we don't know why. The Gemara is going to immediately ask this question why. Ula Omar, Ula dissents, and he holds Af Shoftin v'zorkin al Tmei Sheretz. Tmei Sheretz has the same status as anyone like a Tful Yom who just has to wait till Hariv Shemesh, and tonight on the 15th he will be able to eat the Korban Pesach. We'll check the Korban Pesach on his behalf on the 14th. The Gemara asks Rav, Maishna Tful Yom, the Chazi Liurta Tmei Sheretz Nami Chazi Liurta. Why do you allow bringing the Korban Pesach on behalf of Tful Yom? And the answer is because he'll be roy lechel sapesam alayla. Same thing applies to a tmei sheretz. He can also eat the Korban Pesach at night. So why shouldn't you bring the Korban Pesach on his behalf? And the Gemara answers mechusar tvila, because the tmei sheretz was not tovel. So now we're saying that according to Rav, the reason why we cannot shech the Korban Pesach on behalf of a Tmei Sheretz is because he was not Tovel. So the Gemara immediately asks, Tful Yom Nami Mechusar Hariv Shemesh. He's also Tomei because he cannot become Torah until the nighttime, and yet you allow shechting the Korban Pesach on behalf of a Mechusar Kapara. So the Gemara answers that there's a fundamental difference. Why? Because the Mechusa Kapar is on the 8th day, so he's already passed his 7 days. He went to the mikvah, and the only thing he's missing is the carbon. Is we're going to assume that the carbon will be brought, and he'll be able to eat from the Korban Pesach. And that's only Mechusa Hariv Shemesh. All we have to wait to is till sunset. And with regard to sunset, it's Shimsha Memela Orva. The sun will set. I mean, we have no question about it. The sun will set, and it'll be mutter to eat kodshim, and he'll eat from the Pesach at night. But Tomei Sheretz, he needs to do an action. He's got to be tovel. So the Gemara says, Mechusa Kapar Nami Ha Mechusa Kaparuhu. He has to bring his carbon. So just like you're saying, that in the case of a Tful Yom, he has to, in the case of a Tmei Sheretz, he has to bring his body into a mikvah. Here too, he has to bring his carbon. And the Gemara says, Shekino biyada. He's holding on to the two tziporim, the two birds that he needs to be makriv in his hands. And therefore, since it's already designated, ready to chef, then we're not considering him mechutza maisa. He's not mechutza maisa if it's right here in his hands. So the Gemara says to Tmei Sheretz Nami are mikvah lefanov. There's a mikvah right there, local mikvah. That's also why not assume that he'll go into the mikvah and he'll be able to eat the kodshim at night? So the Gemara says Dilma Pasha means that this whole bit of Rav that we don't shech the Korban Pesach on behalf of a Tmei Sheretz is all drabanan. We're afraid that maybe he'll take his time, and before you know it, he misses the mikvah. Well, how do you know that the Mechusa Kapara, for whom you say you could check the Korban Pesach, will definitely bring his carbon? Maybe it'll be Pochea, and he won't bring his carbon. The Gemara answers, "Kigo de masrinu lebezdin." The case that Rav is dealing with is where the Mechutza Kapara already brought his tziporim to Bezdin, and the Bezdin is the Bezdin Shel Kohen, and they supervise all the Kodshim. And we can rely on the Bezdin Shel Kohanim that they will in fact bring his carbon. Uke Rav Shmaya, and this is similar to a statement that we have of Rav Shmaya the Omar, who says that Chazaka ain't Bezdin Shel Kohanim owned to be Sham ad sheyichlu mos shebeshofros. They used to have these shofros. These were sort of kupos that were located in the Azara, and they would put, it was in the shape of a shofar, means it was wide on top and narrow on the bottom. No, excuse me. Yeah, right, wide on top and narrow on the bottom. And in these shofros were monies that were designated for the kodshim, the karbonos of a mechutza kapara. And the kohanim would never end the day without taking all those mos and buying the karbonos and bringing the karbonos that were designated for this mechutza kapara or these mechutza kapara. So we can rely totally on the Bezdin Shel Kohanim, and in fact the carbon will be brought. In the case of a Tmei Sheretz, and you're talking about whether it'll be Tovel b'mikvah, who knows? Maybe it'll be Pocheh and he won't be Tovel b'mikvah. So the Gemara says, now we see that L'Rav Midaraisa Michsei Chazi, that Rav would say that you could, on a Dorais level, be makriv the carbon on behalf of a Tmei Sheretz. We're just afraid maybe he won't go to the mikvah. For a Banan who the Gazu Bey, it's only a Gezeres Chachamim. That can't be. That contradicts a statement of Rav, which we learned earlier. The Omar Rav, this is back on Daf Pei, 10 blot ago, that if you have a situation where half of the kihila, half of the tzibur is tamei, and the other half is tar, 50-50. So what we do is, says Rav, Mitamim echad b'sheretz. We are going to take one of the tahorim and we're going to push him up against the sheretz in order to tip the scale, because now we'll have rov tmeim, and now we can bring the carbon pesach b'tuma. Now, if Rav holds that a Tommy Sheretz Midaraisa is included in carbon pesach, it's only that we're afraid maybe he'll be pocheh, he won't go to the mikveh, that's Xeris Chachamim. But on a Doraisa level, we will be makriv the carbon on behalf of Tmei Sheretz, because we're assuming he's going to go to mikveh, and by nighttime of the 15th, he'll be able to join us at the Seder and eat the carbon pesach. If that be the case, then what is Rav telling us? That we're going to take one of the 50 tahorim and we're going to be metabi and b'sheretz. But what do you gain by that? That makes you into rov tmeim? What do you mean rov tmeim? We're saying that it's Tmei Sheretz will bring the carbon on his behalf. So we don't have to be metame, bring a carbon pesach b'tumah if he cannot be the deciding vote. Ella says, Rav Rav is going to have to assume that on a Doraisa level, we cannot shech the Korban Pesach on behalf of Tmei Sheretz. And where does he derive it from? The Chsiv, from the Pasuk in Baloscha, in the parish of Pesach Sheni, it says over there, Ish ki yeh tamei l'nefesh. If a person contracts Tumah, the Asa Pesach Hashem Chodesh Hasheni B'Arba'asar Yom, he will bring the Pesach on the 14th of Iyar. Milo Askinon isn't the pasuk referring to a case of Chal Shvi Shalo Liel Spear of Pesach, of a tummy mess on the 7th day since he contracted Tumah, and that day is now Yudalit Ben Nisan, and the Hainu Tumah Sheretz, and that the status of a Tmei mess on the 7th day is exactly identical with that of a Tmei Sheretz. In both cases, we just have to wait till Harev Shemsho, till the sun sets, and then they'll be Tahorim and they can eat from the Korban Pesach. Amar Rachmana de Nidche. And nevertheless, the Torah says Nidche. Nidche means he's pushed off the Pesach Sheni. Why? Because we cannot be marked the carbon on his behalf. So what's the difference between a Tommy Mess on day 7 and a Tmei Sheretz? They're both exactly the same. And if we're saying that we cannot bring the carbon Pesach, meaning Pesach Rishon, on behalf of Tommy Mess on the 7th day, we're going to push him off till Pesach Sheni. The same thing should have to apply to Tommy Sheretz. Hence, Rav derives the conclusion that a Tommy Sheretz, we cannot be mocked the korban on his behalf, even though all he needs is Harif Shemesh. And that's a Doraisa Allah. Hence, when we had that 50-50 case, we're going to be Matami one of the Torah with Tomei Sheretz. So you'll ask me, V'chitema says, how do you know that this pasuk is addressing a case of a tummy mess on the seventh day of his tumah? Maybe the pasuk is talking about a tummy mess, and he hasn't yet reached his seventh day, and therefore he won't be tar by erev. So the Gemara answers that Rav, when he derives from the pasuk Vayihi Anoshim Asher Hayu Tmei L'Nefesh Adam Lo Yochel Lasos HaPesach B'Yom. You may recall that there were a group of people that came in front of Moshe Rabbeinu and they said, look, we're Tmeim and we won't be able to bring our Korban Pesach. Are we at loss here? Are we going to completely lose the opportunity to bring a Korban Pesach? And hence, we have the Parish of Pesach Sheni. And Rav holds, Savar Rabbi Yitzchak, the Omar of Yitzchak says, who are these people that came forward and they said, we are Tmeim L'Nefesh and we cannot bring the Korban Pesach? Tmei Meis Mitzvah Hayu. They were involved in a mitzvah. These were Elazar and Itamar, the brothers of Nadav Avihu, who were burying their own brothers. Shechal Shvi Shalahem, Leos Erev Pesach. The seventh day of their tumah was on Erev Pesach. Shenemar Lo Yochlu Lasot HaPesach Bayom Hahu. The Torah adds these two words Bayom Hahu. Bayom Hahu. What is that special day that they couldn't bring the Pesach? And they waited one more day, but again, that would be too late for the Korban Pesach. But had it been a case where on Yudal Benisa was the day 7, and therefore on the next day they could have brought the Korban Pesach, that would be fine. The Amar Achmana, nevertheless, the Torah says Nidchu. So you see clearly that even a Tameh who could be Mitayr himself, and at nighttime, with nightfall, he can eat the Korban Pesach, which is a case of a Tameh mess on day 7 or a Tmei Sheretz. Nevertheless, we're not going to shech the Korban Pesach on his behalf. So now the Gemara is going to ask a kasha on the opinion of Rav that we don't shech a Korban Pesach on behalf of a Tmei Sheretz. And we learned in the Mishnah, our Mishnah, Zav Sharosh Te Re'ios Shochten Ola B'Shvi. So we said that a Zav who has 2 Re'ios, he has to wait 7 days in order to be Matayr himself and to be Tovel on Yom HaShvi, and then with Harif Shemesh, he can eat Kodshim. And we're going to shech the Korban Pesach on his behalf on Yom HaShvi, even though he needs Harif Shemesh. Now, you just finished telling me that if you have a Tamei mess on day 7 or a Tmei Sheretz on day 1, and if they weren't Tovel, so that's not called a Tful Yom because they weren't Tovel, we're not going to bring the Pesach on their behalf. My love, the lo Tovil, here in the case of a Zav, in our mission of Shtei Re'ios, Pashtus, it would mean that he wasn't Tovel yet, and nevertheless, since he can be Tovel, and with Harif Shemesh he is tar and he can eat from the Korban Pesach, then the Mishnah says Shochten Ola B'Shvi. Shma Mina, Shochten V'Zorchen Al Tmei Sheretz. The same exact situation here applies to Tmei Sheretz, even though he has not yet been Tovel the mikvah, he's Mechusar Tefillah. Nevertheless, since he has the possibility of being Tovel, and then with Harif Shemesh he'll be able to eat the Korban Pesach, we will shech the Korban Pesach on his behalf, and that's exactly equivalent to the case of Zav Sharosh Te Re'ios Be Shochten Ola B'Shvi. Mar rejects this. Low. The Mishnah is not talking about a Zav who did not go to the mikvah, but rather did Tovil. He already went to the mikvah. So before the shechita of the Korban Pesach on his behalf, he had already been in the mikvah. If he wasn't in the mikvah, we're not going to shech the Korban Pesach for him because we don't shech the Pesach according to Rav for a Tmei Sheretz or for a Tmei Mes who did not go to the mikvah. So the Gemara asks, Tovil, Maika Mashma. Why would the Mishnah have to tell me that if he was Tovil, we're going to bring the Korban Pesach on his behalf? Well, what's the chiddush? The Gemara answers, at this moment in time on the 14th, he is not able to eat from kachim because we have to wait till Hariv Shemesh. It's mashmalon, this shimsha memela arva, that since the sun will set, we don't need him to do any action. Therefore, we consider him as if he's tahar as far as shechting the korban pesach on his behalf. Achina mistar. Really wants to bring a support for this interpretation of the Mishnah. And the Mishnah is talking about a zav who already was tovel. If you look at the next part of the Mishnah, it says, Ra'a shalosh re'iyos, shoktan al b'yom hashmini, Iamet bishlema zav sharash teriyat shoktan al b'pesach. Bishvi, did Tavil, he already went to Bikfa. It's true. Now I understand. I justify the need for the safe in the case of Zav, Shara, Shalosh Re'iyos. We should check the Korban Pesach for him on the Shmini. Salkadak, I would have thought that in the case of a Zav who saw Shtei Re'iyos, we can check the Korban Pesach on his behalf on the 7th day. Who and why? Because the Zav is Eino Mechutza Maisa. If we're talking about a case where we only saw Shtei Re'iyos, he doesn't need to bring a korban. All he has to do is wait till Hariv Shemesh, and then he can eat from Kodesh. And the Shemesh Memela on its own will set. Aval, but in the case of a Zav, a full-fledged Zav, there are Shalosh Re'iyos, and you're on the 8th day, the Mechutza Maisa, who now he has to bring his korban because he's a full-fledged Zav. A Zav can't eat Kodesh until he brings his own korban. Is low. We're not going to shech the korban on his behalf. Is kamash malon the afagav the mechusa kapar shokta v'zork anyway. Now, if you're going to tell me that the case of Rosh Terios in the Reisha is a case of the Tovil, since he was Tovil, all he needs is Hariv Shemesh, because Terios doesn't require a kapara, a korban on the next day, on the 8th day, then I justify the chiddush of the sefer. The sefer is coming to Mechadesh that if he's a full-fledged Zav and he hasn't brought his korban yet, then on Yom HaShmini, we will be makriv the Pesach on his behalf, and we'll assume that he will bring his kapar. That's the chiddush of the sefer. Ela I amrit. Now again, why do we assume he will bring his kapar? That's because, if you recall, the monies for the birds were already put into the pushka, into the shofar, and we can rely on the Beis Din Shel Kohanim that they will indeed guarantee that they purchase and bring those birds as a korban. But Ela Iyamrit, if you're going to tell me that when the Mishnah says Rosh Terios, we can check the korban pesach of him on the 7th day, is the lo toval, he wasn't tovel. Is Rosh Shalosh Bishlichi Bishmini Lamali. Now we're going to have a problem. We don't understand why the Sefer was necessary in the case of a Zav who saw Shalosh Re'iyos. Why? Hashto, let's say the following Kavachom. Yesh Lomar Rosh Re'iyos Bishvi Delo Tavil Ditami Ma'alya Gomor. In the case of a Zav that had 2 re'iyos, and despite the fact that he didn't go into the mikvah and it's a full-fledged tummy, nevertheless we'll check the korban pesach on his behalf. Shochtev v'zark and iluye is Zav in the case of Rosh Shalosh re'iyos. If erev Pesach is chal on the 8th day, the Tovile, he was already Tovel on the 7th day, he just hasn't brought his kapara yet. B'yom Shvi is Klisha Tuma. He's no longer full-fledged tummy. He's already gone into the mikvah. It's lo kolchke the shachtina and v'zakina and iluye. How much more so that for sure we could shech and be zorik the korban on his behalf. So why did the Mishnah need to tell me this then? Elalav shmamina. Therefore, we have to conclude that the ratio of Rosh Teira Eos B'Shvi Shachtina and Iluye, we shech the korban pesach on his behalf, is the Tavil, because he was Tovil. The Gemara says, "Lo, I'm going to reject this raya. It's not a full-fledged proof. Why? Leola, maybe I'm going to tell you the Lotavi. That Enochinami, the ratio, when it talks about Ezav, who saw Shtei Eos, which shechting the Korban Pesach on his behalf on Yom Shvi, he was not Tovim. But we still assume that since Biyodo, he has the mikvah b'fanav, he will be Tovim. And therefore we'll check the Korban Pesach on his behalf. Nevertheless, I still need the Sefer in the case of Sholosh Re'iyos, and we're going to check the Korban Pesach on Yom Hashmini. I would have thought that Shmi who to be Sake. In the case of the Shvi'i, there he just has to go into the mikvah. He doesn't need anyone's okay for that. He doesn't need any partnership. Avo, but in the case of a Zav Sholosh Re'iyos, and it's on the 8th day, and he can't eat from Kachim unless he brings his karman. That's not Biyado. He doesn't have the control of bringing the karman. He needs the kohen for it. Is the Ein Biyado Lahakav karban? And therefore, I would have assumed that we cannot check the Korban Pesach on his behalf. And V'ema Pashi Bey Kohanu, I might think that even if he gave the carbon over to the Kohanim, maybe they won't be mindful and they'll be neglectful, and then there's no kapara. Kamash Malan, that's what he wants to teach me. That's what the Mishnah wants to teach me, that we're not choshesh, that the Kohanim will be hoshim. Why? Kid Reb Shmaya, as we saw earlier in Reb Shmaya, that the Kohanim are absolutely reliable, and therefore it's almost as if the carbon was already brought, and therefore he's tar and he can eat from the Korban Pesach. The Mishnah says, "Hazava shochtin olev b'shmini." That in the case of a zava, we can shech the Korban Pesach on her behalf on day 8, which is the day of her kapara that she brings the carbon. Tani Tani Kami the Rabbi Abba, the Rabbi Barafa. There's a price that was brought in front of Rabbi Adda. And the Bryce says, "Va'azava shoftin olev b'shvi shala." That a zava, you can bring the carbon on her behalf on shvi. That's very difficult. Amalei, Rav Ada says to him, "Zava b'shvi shala michazi." How can you say that we can shech the Korban Pesach on her behalf on shvi? I feel even according to Ula, who says shoftim v'zocher al tmei sheretz, hani mili b'tmei sheretz lechazi l'urta. We can bring a Korban Pesach on behalf of someone who just has to wait until sunset. But she can't eat kosher until the 8th day tomorrow, when she can bring the carbon. She'll bring her carbon kapara. You have to rewrite the brisa b'yom hashmini. It certainly has to refer to a zava on the 8th day. So now the Gemara says pshita. Well, if it's the 8th day, then why did the brisa feel compelled to teach me that which I know? Well, the same I would have thought, if not for this price, Kevon de Mechasr Kapara, since the Zava on the 8th day still needs a carbon, she cannot eat from Kodshim, is therefore low. We shouldn't be marked of the carbon on her behalf. She's a Mechusa Maisa Kapara. Kamash Malan, Kidarabi Shemaya, that if the monies for the carbon were already deposited in the hands of the shofars and the hands of the Bezin Shalkonim, they will definitely, we can rely on them, they will definitely bring the car. Ravina has a different version of the Bryce. Ravina Omar Nida Tani Kame. The Bryce was talking about a Nida. A Nida Shoftin Olev B'Shvi. Amalei, wait a second. Nida B'Shvi Michazia. And again, I feel even according to Ula, that Shoftim is Zochen al Tmei Sheretz, that's because Chazi Leurta. But neither Leurta the Shvi Hu de Tovla, the Achmini the of the Arif Sheretz Lo Chazi. So the Nida cannot be Toveles on Shvi. That's the difference between a Nida and a Zava. A Zava, on the 7th day, when she counted Zainakiyim, she could be Tovelis on the 7th day. A Nida cannot be Tovelis until after the 7th day passes. So we cannot possibly bring the carbon on her behalf on the 7th day, when on that day she has no possibility of being Matayra herself. Not even a Mikzah's Tara. Because there is no Tefillah on Yom HaShvi of a Nida. How can you possibly say that we'll bring the Korban Pesach on behalf of Nid on Yom Shvi? La'ema v'Shmini. We're going to have to make a correction in the language of the Brisa, and it's Yom HaShmini. But wait a second, Pshita. A Nida doesn't have to bring a carbon in order to eat kachim. All she needs to do is, after the 7-day passes, go to mikvah. So why would I even have a hot meeting on her 8th day when she's completely Torah? She doesn't, right? She already went to mikvah, and she doesn't need to bring a carbon that we can check the Korban Pesach on her behalf. Even in the case of a Zava, we said that on the 8th day, we can shech the Korban Pesach on her behalf. Even though she still needs to bring her kapara, is neither the machasir kapara, neither doesn't require any karbonis. It's trichel and meimar. Do you have to tell me the shoftin bezorken aleh? Neither it's yes, there is a chiddush in the case of neither. Why? A kamashmalan, the chiddush is that bashmini in b'shvi lo, that we can shech the Korban Pesach on her behalf on Shmini, but not on Shvi. It is Sanya. In other words, basically, what the chiddush here is in this brisa regarding Nida is that she cannot go to mikvah on the 7th day. It is Sanya like word to Bakol Chavit feels to be lost of the yom. Anyone who's tamei on the day of Tara, they can go to mikvah on that day. They don't have to wait till the day passes. Chutz, but the exceptions are Nida violetis shetfilasen b'layla. They cannot be tovelas during the day. They have to wait till nightfall. Tanyas, we learned in the Brisa, Yochel Tehei Tovelas Bojon. You might think that a Nida could be Tovelas on the 7th day itself. She's a full-fledged Nida for 7 days. Tehei Benidasa called Shiva. She's a Nida all 7, and there's no meaningful, valid Tvila before the 7th day passes. Yoletis is Keshla Nida, and Yoletis has the same din as a Nida. There's no Tvila on that 7th day. She has to wait till nighttime. That's based on the Hekesh between Nida and Yoletis. And this leads us to the Mishnah here on the bottom of Daf Tzadi Yom Beis. We'll just quickly learn the Mishnah, and then in Mitzvah Shem, over Shabbos, we'll learn the Gemara on Daf Tzadi Aleph. Oneim. Now the Mishnah gives us a list of different people that we could shech the Korban Pesach on their behalf. So an onein means he lost one of his close relatives, and the kvura, the burial, has not yet taken place. And you might be choshesh that maybe he will come to bury the mess, will become tameh, and he won't be able to eat the Korban Pesach at night. But nevertheless, we're not choshesh. We're not afraid that he'll become and he'll contract tumah. Amfakech Sagal, the top here of Tzadi Aleph, the Mishnah says that if a person is he's in a rescue team and they're trying to dig up the debris to see if they can find a live body, and we don't know when they found the body whether it's alive or not. Maybe the body died, and therefore the person who's standing on top of this gal, he's called a mahil al mes, and he contracts tumah, and he won't be able to eat the Korban Pesach. His jail sentence term comes to fruition on that day of the 14th of Nisan, and they promised him that they would release him. And the chol and the zakin on the menuyim on the carbon. And right now, at this stage, they're capable of eating kizayis. If they get worse, if the situation deteriorates, they won't be able to eat a kizayis pesach. But in all these cases, shoftin aleim. We're not worried about the possibility that they won't be able to eat the Korban Pesach. Kulon ain't shoftin aleim bifnei af. However, we should guarantee, to cover all our bases, that there be somebody who's absolutely certain to eat from the Korban Pesach, included in the chabura of that particular Korban Pesach. Why? Shema yaviru es ha-pesach lidei psul. Because it's possible that any of the above, if there are no other additional minuyim, might not be able to eat from the carbon pesach. And then you bring in Kodshim L'beis HaPsul. Ulefichach, therefore, in Ira Bahen Psul, Turmi Lasos Pesach Shem. In any of these cases, where at the time of the Shechita and the Zrika, they were right to eat the Korban Pesach, and we shechted the Korban Pesach, we were Zorik the Dam on their behalf. If something happens and they weren't able to eat the Korban Pesach, nevertheless, they don't have to bring a Pesach Sheni. They were already Yotzei the Chiyuv with the Pesach Rishon. Chutz mi menafakeach begal, shu tamei mitchilosa. Now we're talking about a case where they were part of a rescue team, and at the end they did discover a dead body. And in such a case, he would have to bring a Korban Pesach Sheni because he's certainly tamei. He was Mahil Alames, and we discovered that there is a corpse there. Therefore, in that case, we know before the Shechita, the Korban, that he's tamei, then for sure he cannot bring a Korban Pesach, he'll be pushed off to Pesach Sheni. So this is where we're going to stop for today. Here on the top of Daf Tzadi Aleph, the Gemara, the Sugis HaGemara, and Amir Hashem, on Yom Rishon, we will be up to Tzadi Beis, 92. Wish everyone a great Shabbos, and if you could join me for a little bit of learning Chumash with Meshech Chochmah, that'll be at 9:45 minutes.
Sure.
Good. Thank you so much, Shabbat.